There is a photograph sitting in a dusty envelope in an attic in Oregon. For 31 years nobody looked at it the right way. Nobody looked at the parts of it that were dark. And because of that one mistake, a killer stood beside police officers, drank coffee with a grieving family, and pointed his own finger toward the wrong patch of forest, sending hundreds of searchers away from the truth every single day for 3 decades. This is the story of a bride and groom who vanished 4 weeks after their wedding, of a car found locked with the keys still inside, of a single line of boot prints marching into a forest that swallowed sound itself, and of the one piece of film that nobody thought to develop. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly how a monster can smile in a wedding photo, shake your hand at a search site, and walk free for 31 years while the people who loved his victims stood right next to him, thanking him for his help. Let's go back to where it started. Oak Creek, Oregon. Autumn of 1988. It was the kind of town where everybody's business belonged to everybody else in the warmest possible way. Neighbors waved from porches. Kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. And in that town, there was a couple that everyone had already decided was destined for a long, quiet, happy life together. Mark Evans was 26 years old, an accountant at a regional shipping company, the kind of man who double-checked his locks before bed and never once, in his entire adult life, forgot a birthday. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He was steady in a way that made the people around him feel safe. Sarah, his fiancée, was 24, a second-grade teacher with a laugh that carried down hallways and a heart so soft that she couldn't walk past a stray cat without bringing it home. They had been together since high school. Everyone in Oak Creek had watched them grow up, fall in love, and become the couple that other couples quietly measured themselves against. In early September of 1988, they got married. It wasn't extravagant. It didn't need to be. The ceremony was held in a small community church at the edge of town, the kind with creaky wooden pews and stained glass windows that scattered colored light across the floor when the sun hit them just right. Nearly 200 friends and family packed into that little church, surrounded by trees that had already begun turning gold and amber for the season. The photographs from that day show a young man in a dark suit with his arm wrapped tightly around a woman in a flowing white dress, her smile so wide and so genuine that even now, decades later, it's hard to look at those pictures without feeling something catch in your chest. They didn't have the money for some grand honeymoon overseas. So instead, they drove the California coastline for a week, windows down, radio on, stopping wherever looked pretty enough to stop. When they came home, they moved into a small rented house with a white picket fence, the kind of starter home that young couples buy when they're just beginning to build a life together. Mark went back to his ledgers and his spreadsheets. Sarah went back to her classroom, pinning up construction paper leaves for her second graders. Sunday dinners with their parents. Morning coffee on the porch. It was, by every outward appearance, an unremarkable, deeply happy life. And then, exactly 4 weeks after their wedding day, that life ended in a single afternoon. Friday, October 14, 1988. Mark and Sarah had planned a small weekend trip to celebrate their 1-month anniversary, a rustic cabin near the foothills of Mount Hood, about 2 hours from home. Nothing elaborate. Just hiking, fishing, a fire at night, and some quiet time away from the world. Mark told his younger brother, David, that they'd be back Sunday evening, right around sunset. That Friday afternoon, a neighbor saw Mark loading a cooler and a canvas duffel bag into their green Ford station wagon. Sarah was seen locking the front door, laughing at something Mark said, sliding into the passenger seat beside him. The car pulled away from the curb, turned the corner at the end of the street, and disappeared from view. Nobody in Oak Creek ever saw them again. Sunday evening came and went. The sky darkened, a cold rain began to fall, and their driveway sat empty, the porch light dark. By Monday morning, the quiet unease that had settled over a few neighbors turned into something sharper. At 8 o'clock, the principal at Sarah's school noticed she hadn't signed in, completely unlike her, since she was always the teacher who arrived 30 minutes early to get her chalkboard ready. The phone at their house rang and rang into an empty living room. Across town, Mark's manager was just as baffled. Mark had never missed a day of work without calling ahead, not once in the years he'd worked there. By 10 that morning, Sarah's mother, Evelyn, got the call. And in an instant, something cold and heavy dropped into the pit of her stomach. She knew her daughter. She knew her son-in-law. Neither one of them would simply vanish without a word. Evelyn drove straight to their house and let herself in with her spare key. What she found inside was almost worse than finding nothing at all, because everything was exactly as it should be. Breakfast dishes from Friday morning still drying neatly in the rack. Mail piling gently in the slot by the door. The house looked as though time itself had paused the second Mark and Sarah walked out of it. By that afternoon, the police were involved, and a deputy was sent up to check the rental cabin near Mount Hood. What he found waiting for him there told everyone that something had gone terribly wrong long before the couple ever reached their destination. The cabin's lockbox was still sealed. The cabin itself was untouched. Mark and Sarah had never checked in. That single detail turned a quiet family worry into a full-blown emergency. If they'd never made it to the cabin, then where, in the 2-hour drive along a straightforward, well-paved highway, had they gone? Search teams fanned out along the route. They checked ravines in case the car had slid off the wet road. They checked gas stations, diners, anywhere a traveler might stop. Nothing. No one had seen the green station wagon anywhere along that highway. Then, on Tuesday morning, as the fog was just beginning to burn off the mountainside, a state forestry worker driving down an old, unpaved logging road, miles from the main highway nowhere near the route to the cabin, spotted something that made him stop his truck cold. Parked at an odd angle near a line of towering pines was a green Ford station wagon, dusted with a thin layer of fallen pine needles, as if it had been sitting there, untouched, for days. Within the hour, police cruisers were roaring up that dirt road, sirens slicing through the silence of the forest. Mark's brother David arrived with one of the search teams and practically threw himself out of the car the moment it stopped. His heart was hammering. The car looked wrong out there, wrong in a way he couldn't quite name, too still, too clean, sitting in the middle of a wilderness that had no business holding it. And that's when the details started to get strange. Because the car wasn't damaged. There was no accident. No broken glass, no crumpled metal, no skid marks. The tires were fine. But when the lead detective, a veteran investigator named Thomas Harris, leaned in close to the driver's side window, he felt something crawl up the back of his neck. The doors were locked. And sitting right there on the driver's seat, gleaming faintly in the morning light, were the keys. On the passenger side floor sat Sarah's brown leather purse, completely untouched. Her wallet, her ID, her credit cards, nearly $200 in cash, all still inside. A thermos of coffee sat frozen solid in the cup holder. No struggle. No blood. No broken windows. It looked, impossibly, as though Mark and Sarah had simply parked the car themselves, locked the doors from the inside, left the keys behind, and stepped out into the wilderness on their own. But it was what sat on the dashboard that made Detective Harris's blood run cold. Spread open, pressed flat against the windshield, was a heavily creased topographical map of the mountain range. And drawn across it in thick, frantic red ink was a jagged circle, a wild, desperate mark that pointed straight toward a remote stretch of forest the locals called Whisper Basin. No trails. No views. No reason for anyone to go there. Just dense trees and silence. And just outside the driver's door, pressed deep into the mud, was a single line of boot prints. Not two sets. One. And they didn't lead back toward the road. They marched straight into the tree line, straight toward the basin, as if something had pulled Mark and Sarah into those woods, or something had chased them there. That was the moment the case stopped being a missing persons report and became something far darker. And it would take 31 years, a lucky accident with a desk lamp, and a dusty attic box nobody had opened since 1991, before anyone understood exactly what had happened on that mountain, and who had been standing right beside the investigation the entire time. Detective Harris ordered the scene locked down immediately. Yellow tape went up between the pines, a fragile little boundary against an entire wilderness that seemed to be holding its secrets close. The first mystery investigators had to untangle was mechanical, almost mundane in the face of everything else. This was an older Ford with manual push-down locks. Someone had pushed those locks down from the inside, stepped out, and shut the door, leaving the keys behind on the seat. But if Mark and Sarah had simply decided to walk into the woods, why lock themselves out of their own car? And if someone else had done it, where was their second set of footprints? Forensic teams dusted every inch of the exterior, fighting against a night of freezing rain that had already washed away most of what might have been useful. When they finally pried the car open, the stale, frozen air came rushing out at them. Investigators cataloged everything with the kind of grim thoroughness that comes from knowing every item might be the one that matters. Sarah's purse, nothing missing. Her lipstick, her checkbook, all of it right where it should be. In the back seat, the packed duffel bag, thick sweaters, wool socks, hiking gear. A cooler of sandwiches and soda, untouched. Whatever had happened to Mark and Sarah, it had happened right here on this desolate dirt road, long before they ever reached their cabin. And in that new angle of light, in the shadows the bulb was casting, Harris saw something he had missed for 4 straight months. Faint indentations in the paper, right beside the red circle, the kind of marks left when someone presses hard with a pen on a piece of paper resting on top of another. Someone had written something. And whatever it was, It had scarred straight through into the map underneath. Harris grabbed a magnifying glass from his desk drawer and barely breathed as he leaned in. The next morning he was standing in the office of the State Crime Lab's lead document examiner, cutting through every waiting list, demanding they run the map through an electrostatic detection device. A machine built specifically to lift indentations like these off of paper. 3 hours later, in a darkened lab, a technician placed a treated sheet on a light board and told Harris quietly that he didn't know what he was looking at, but whoever wrote it had been terrified. Harris stepped up to the board. The handwriting was rushed, frantic, but unmistakably legible now. 2 sentences. Nothing more. We were wrong about the car following us. He is at the wedding. He is in the pictures. The chill that went through Harris in that moment reshaped the entire case. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't 2 people wandering off a trail. Mark and Sarah had known in their final moments that someone was after them. They hadn't vanished by chance. They had been hunted, and somehow, impossibly, the person hunting them had also been standing among the 200 guests at their wedding. Harris pieced together what he believed had happened. Mark and Sarah must have picked up their wedding photographs Friday afternoon, right before leaving for the cabin. Somewhere on that lonely mountain highway, they noticed a car trailing behind them, probably nothing more than an annoyance at first. But as Sarah flipped through the freshly printed pictures in the passenger seat, something in one of them must have caught her eye. She looked at the photo. She looked out the back window at the vehicle behind them. And she realized, with a horror that must have been instantaneous, that the stranger following them up the mountain was the same stranger lurking in the background of their wedding day. They panicked. They turned off the highway, hoping the unpaved logging road might lose whoever was behind them in the maze of the forest. But it was a dead end. Trapped, with the rain coming down and a stranger's vehicle closing in, Mark grabbed a pen and pressed those 2 sentences into the map with everything he had, hoping someone someday would find them. Then they locked the doors, left the keys behind, and ran. By morning the precinct was in chaos. Every photograph from the wedding, the professional album, the glossy prints found in Sarah's purse, was pulled and pinned to a corkboard that stretched across an entire wall. Detectives interviewed every single guest. They studied every face with magnifying glasses until their eyes ached. And they found nothing. Every photograph was perfectly ordinary. Smiling aunts. Laughing cousins. Every single face was identified, cleared, accounted for. There was no mysterious man in the background. No stranger hiding at the edge of the frame. The investigation, which had seemed to be on the verge of a breakthrough, collapsed entirely. Had Mark and Sarah imagined it? Misread something? Picked up the wrong envelope of photos entirely? Without a face there was no suspect. And without a suspect there was nowhere left to go. Time did what time always does to unsolved cases. It wore them down, quietly and completely. The posters yellowed and came down. The search maps were rolled up and shoved into storage tubes. The green station wagon sat rusting in an impound lot for 5 years before it was finally crushed for scrap. The 80s gave way to the 90s, and the 90s gave way to a new millennium, while the forests around Mount Hood kept their secrets buried under fresh snow year after year after year. Thomas Harris grew old at that desk. His hair turned white. The stress wore down his heart, and in 2005 he was forced into retirement. On his last day before he packed up his box of belongings, he photocopied that map and its hidden note, folded the copy and tucked it into his wallet, a piece of failure he carried with him every day for the rest of his life. Evelyn never recovered. She refused to change the locks. She refused to sell the house. She spent 3 decades in a kind of frozen grief, surrounded by fading photographs of a daughter who never came home. David built a life anyway. Married, moved to a neighboring town, raised 3 kids, built a successful business, but the ghost of that mountain never left him. Every hard rain still brought back the image of his brother and Sarah running through freezing mud. 31 years passed. The disappearance of Mark and Sarah Evans became a local legend, the kind of story people told around campfires and half believed. And then, in the late autumn of 2019, everything changed in the way that these things so often do, quietly, accidentally, through a task nobody wanted to do. Evelyn passed away peacefully in her sleep at 82. With no other children, it fell to David to clear out the house she had refused to change for 30 years. It was slow, exhausting work. Sorting dishes, donating furniture, throwing out expired cans that had probably been sitting in that pantry since the Clinton administration. On a quiet, rainy Tuesday afternoon, David pulled down the creaking attic stairs and climbed up into air that felt like it hadn't moved in decades. Buried under a pile of old winter blankets in the back corner, he found a heavy plastic storage bin. Written across the side in thick black marker, Sarah's Things, Oak Creek PD Evidence Release, 1991. David knelt there on the dusty floorboards, his hands trembling slightly, understanding immediately what this was: the box of personal effects the police had returned to the family once the case had gone fully cold, evidence too painful for Evelyn to look at, so she'd simply hidden it and never spoke of it again. He sliced through the brittle tape with a pocket knife and lifted the lid. The faint, impossible scent of Sarah's floral perfume, 30 years old and somehow still there, drifted up into the cold air. Inside, the wool sweaters from the duffel bag, the creased topographical map, Sarah's brown leather purse. And at the very bottom, tucked beneath a folded jacket, a small yellow envelope from a 1-hour photo lab. David opened it. Inside were the same glossy prints police had stared at for months back in 1988. His brother in his dark suit, Sarah radiant in white, his own younger self laughing somewhere in the background with a drink in his hand. Nothing new. No stranger. Just the same photographs that had led nowhere 3 decades earlier. He sighed, already bracing for disappointment, and started to slide the prints back into the envelope. That's when he noticed something else tucked into the back pocket of the envelope, a small paper sleeve he'd nearly missed. Inside it, strips of brown negative film. David held one up to the single bare bulb hanging from the attic ceiling and counted the frames. 36. But there were only 24 glossy prints in his hand. And that's when it hit him. Back in the 80s, photo labs didn't print every single frame on a roll of film automatically. If a shot came out too dark, too blurry, too underexposed, the machine skipped it. No point wasting paper and chemicals on a picture nobody could see anything in. The lab handed customers only the ones that worked. The failed frames just sat there, forgotten, on the negative strip. Nobody in 1988 had any reason to think there was anything on those unprinted frames worth looking at. So nobody ever did. David's heart started pounding. What if Sarah, bored on that long drive, had pulled these very strips out of the envelope and held them up to the car window, squinting at one of the dark, unprinted frames? What if she'd seen something there that no glossy print had ever shown anyone? He didn't sleep that night. First thing the next morning, he drove 2 hours into Portland and found a specialized lab that dealt in restoring old and damaged film. He handed over the 31-year-old negatives and asked for every single frame to be scanned at the highest resolution possible. Especially, he said, the dark ones. The technician warned him the emulsion might be ruined after decades in an attic that baked in summer and froze in winter. It would take a week. That week felt endless. David paced his house at night, turning those 2 chilling sentences over and over in his mind. He is in the pictures. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff he'd been circling for 31 years, finally about to look down. 7 days later, at exactly 8 in the evening, his laptop chimed with an email, a link to a secure gallery. David sat alone at his kitchen table while rain tapped against the window, the same kind of cold rain that had been falling the weekend Mark and Sarah disappeared. He clicked the link. He downloaded the folder. He opened the first image. It was stunning. Modern technology pulling detail out of decades-old film that no eye had ever properly seen. The texture of Mark's suit. Individual leaves on the autumn trees. He clicked through image after image, all of them the same photographs the police had already exhausted years ago. Then he reached image 25, the point where the glossy prints had stopped. From here on, he was looking at frames no living person had ever truly seen. Image 25, dark, grainy, a blurry shot of the church parking lot at night, the software struggling to pull anything usable out of the shadows. Image 26, another shot of the same parking lot, maybe Sarah testing the camera. Then David clicked to image 27, and his breath caught somewhere in his throat and simply stopped. Mark stood by the open trunk of the green station wagon, loading wedding gifts, completely unaware of the camera. But across the street, in the shadow of a large oak tree, sat a dark, heavy pickup truck. And leaning against the driver's door, half lit by whatever the digital scanner had managed to coax out of the darkness, stood the tall, broad figure of a man, staring directly across the street at Mark. David's hand started shaking. He clicked to the final frame on the roll, image 28. Sarah, apparently stepping closer to the street for one last shot, the flash catching just enough of the man's face for the modern scanner to actually resolve it. David zoomed in again. The software smoothed the pixelation and a face filled the screen. He gasped and shoved his chair back so hard it nearly tipped over, his hand flying to his mouth. He knew that face. He recognized that heavy canvas jacket, those specific custom-laced hunting boots with the deep, ridged rubber soles. He didn't hesitate for even a second. He slammed the laptop shut, grabbed his keys and ran out into the rain. He drove recklessly, well over the speed limit, heading straight for the small rural town where retired Detective Thomas Harris now lived. The drive took nearly an hour. To David it felt like seconds. He pulled into Harris's driveway, tires skidding on wet gravel, and pounded on the front door until the porch light flicked on. Harris opened the door in a flannel robe, blinking at David through wire-rimmed glasses, half asleep and completely confused. David didn't say a word. He pushed past him into the living room, opened his laptop on the coffee table with trembling hands, and pulled up image 28, the face, the boots, all of it. Harris slid on his reading glasses and leaned in. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the room was rain against the roof. Then the color drained entirely out of the old detective's face. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles went white. "David," he whispered in a voice that didn't sound like his own. "Tell me this isn't real." "It's real," David choked out, tears finally breaking loose. It was in the negatives. The police never developed them. He was standing right there watching them load the car. Harris stared at those boots. At that jacket. And slowly, horribly, he understood exactly whose face he was looking at. It was the face of a man who had been the very first person to show up when Mark and Sarah were reported missing. A man who had walked shoulder to shoulder with the police for 2 straight weeks. A man who had commanded volunteer search teams, and again, gently steered them away from the deepest parts of the woods. "My God," Harris breathed, stepping back from the laptop like it had physically burned him. "He wasn't just following them, David. He was hunting them. And we let him lead the search." The living room fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. David's voice, when he found it again, came out low and dangerous. "Who is that man, Thomas? Tell me who that is." Harris reached out and touched the edge of the screen, tracing the grainy outline of a face he clearly hadn't forgotten in 31 years. "His name is Elias Thorne," he said. "A local logging contractor. A lifelong woodsman, he knew every inch of that mountain better than anyone alive. When Mark and Sarah went missing, we didn't have enough deputies to cover that terrain, so we put out a call for civilian volunteers who knew the land. Thorne was the first one to show up at the command tent. Brought his own maps. Brought his own floodlights. People just naturally looked to him. We deputized him. Gave him a radio. Gave him control of entire search grids." The full, sickening weight of it landed on David all at once. He remembered the search, remembered walking through freezing mud for weeks, screaming his brother's name. He remembered a tall, quiet man in a dark canvas jacket handing him a cup of hot coffee, telling him not to lose hope. "He steered us away," Harris whispered, the memory clearly rising up and choking him. "There was a morning the dogs picked up a strong scent heading east into the ravines, pulling hard on their leads. And Thorne stopped the whole line. Pointed at some broken branches by the riverbank, swore the trail had washed out in the current, told us the dogs were just chasing a deer path. He talked us into moving the entire search 5 miles west." Something in David went white-hot. The man who had hunted his brother and sister-in-law hadn't just gotten away. He had stood directly beside the police the entire time, controlling the investigation from inside it, watching David cry in those woods while knowing exactly where Mark and Sarah were. David turned toward the door. "Where does he live?" "I'm going right now." "Stop." Harris grabbed his shoulder with a strength that surprised them both. "If you go to his house with a rifle, you go to prison, and Elias Thorne walks free claiming self-defense. We have one piece of evidence after 31 years, one photograph. Do this wrong and a judge throws it out and he dies a free man in his own bed. We are doing this by the book. Every step of it." Harris picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. At 2 in the morning he woke Captain Robert Miller, now head of the Oak Creek precinct. But back in 1988, a 22-year-old rookie who'd stood in the rain guarding that abandoned station wagon. Within the hour, Miller was standing in Harris's living room, and when he saw the photograph, the color drained out of his face exactly the way it had out of Harris's. The three of them wasted no time. As the sun rose gray and wet over Oak Creek, they drove to the precinct and pulled the old evidence bins from long-term storage, dusty, sealed, untouched for years. They needed something undeniable, something physical that connected this photograph directly to the crime scene, something strong enough to convince a judge to sign off on a search warrant against a 74-year-old man. Inside one small box, wrapped carefully in foam, was a solid plaster cast. The mold forensics had taken of that single line of boot prints outside the station wagon, all those years ago. They set it under bright light next to David's laptop, next to the zoomed image of Thorne standing in the dark parking lot. It was an exact match. The custom stitching. The distinct ridge tread. The reinforced heel. The same boots that had marched into Whisper Basin were the same boots caught by Sarah's camera flash outside the church. But they still needed a motive, a reason an ordinary young accountant and his new wife would ever cross paths with an isolated logging contractor in the first place. Harris and Miller spent the next 12 hours tearing through Mark and Sarah's financial records from the 6 months before the wedding, looking for any point of contact. At 4 in the afternoon, Miller found it, a carbon copy of a check, dated August 12, 1988, 1 month before the wedding. $450, made out to Thorn Timber and Contracting. In the memo line in Mark's neat handwriting, front yard picket fence. The truth settled over the room like something physically heavy. Thorn hadn't spotted them randomly on some highway. Mark had hired him. For 2 full weeks that August, Elias Thorn had worked right outside their front door, digging post holes, building that picket fence, and watching Mark leave for work every morning. Watching Sarah sit on the porch with her coffee, offering him glasses of ice water because she was kind to absolutely everyone including him. Listening through open windows as they talked about their wedding, their honeymoon, their weekend trip to a cabin near Mount Hood. The stalking hadn't started on some mountain highway. It had started in their own front yard in broad daylight, while they smiled at him and offered him something cold to drink. With the plaster cast, the photograph, and the financial trail, Captain Miller had more than enough. He drove straight to the courthouse, and a judge, after one look at the evidence, signed a high-risk search and arrest warrant for Elias Thorn and his entire property without a second's hesitation. By that evening, the precinct was in lockdown. A tactical team was called in. Armored vehicles lined the wet streets as freezing rain came down again, almost as if the weather itself remembered. David was made to stay behind, pacing Captain Miller's office like something caged, eyes glued to the radio on the desk, while Harris sat quietly nearby, reminding him again and again that justice needed patience, even now, even after 31 years. Out at the edge of the county, on the outskirts of the Mount Hood wilderness, the convoy killed its headlights and rolled in dark down a long dirt road. Thorn's property was 60 acres, wrapped in a 10-foot chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire, no trespassing signs nailed to every tree along the perimeter. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to keep the world out, or something else in. The tactical team moved with total silence, cutting through the chain gate, spreading out through mud and rain, flashlight beams sweeping the dark tree line. At the center of the property sat a rotting 2-story wooden house, dark, silent, no lights on anywhere. On the officer's signal, a battering ram splintered the front door into 1,000 pieces, and the team flooded inside, weapons raised, voices barking commands into the dark. They found Elias Thorn sitting alone in a rotting leather recliner in the pitch-black living room, the only light in the house the faint blue flicker of a muted television. He didn't flinch when the door came down. Didn't reach for a weapon. Didn't even look surprised. He was 74 now, gray-haired and frail in some ways, but he still carried the broad, heavy frame of a man who had spent his whole life working timber. As half a dozen laser sights settled on his chest, he slowly turned his head, looked at the officers surrounding him, and smiled. A slow, empty, chilling smile. Then he raised his hands, wrists together, ready to be cuffed, as if he'd simply been waiting for this exact moment for 31 years. He didn't say a single word as they dragged him out into the rain and put him in the back of a cruiser. But the arrest was only the beginning. Now came the terrible work of finding out exactly what had happened, and where. Cadaver dogs swept the property. Ground-penetrating radar scanned for disturbed earth beneath 60 acres of scrap metal and dense forest. For hours in the freezing rain they found nothing. Then, shortly after midnight, one of the dogs broke away from its handler and bolted toward the far back edge of the property, barking frantically at a massive, overgrown mound of earth tangled in blackberry thorns and rotting canvas tarps. Officers hacked through the vines with machetes and pulled the tarps aside, revealing something built directly into the hillside, a pair of heavy reinforced steel doors, sealed with 3 padlocks that, unlike everything else on the property, looked untouched by decades of weather. Bolt cutters snapped the locks free in 3 sharp cracks that echoed through the trees, and Captain Miller wrenched the door open, releasing a rush of stale, ancient, freezing air from somewhere far below. A narrow concrete staircase led down into total darkness. Miller called out, "Police!" And the only answer was silence, thick enough to feel. He descended slowly, 3 armed officers close behind, the rain fading away above them as the cold pressed in. What they found at the bottom wasn't a dungeon. It wasn't a torture chamber. It was something almost worse, a shrine, clean and deliberately preserved, as though someone had spent 31 years tending to it like a memorial. On a wooden table against the far wall sat the items that had vanished with Mark and Sarah in 1988. Mark's silver watch, polished and gleaming. Sarah's wedding ring resting on a small square of velvet. A set of Ford car keys hanging from a faded leather keychain, the very keys that had locked that station wagon so long ago. And at the center of the table sat a thick, worn leather journal. Captain Miller's hands shook as he opened the cover and shone his flashlight onto the first page, and in that instant 31 years of silence finally began to break apart. The handwriting inside was small, neat and unsettlingly obsessive. It began in August of 1988, the week Thorne had been hired to build that white picket fence. He wrote about the summer heat on his back as he dug post holes. He wrote about Sarah, the way she smiled handing him a glass of ice water, the scent of her perfume. And in those pages, his delusion revealed itself in full. He believed Sarah was something far more than an ordinary young woman, that she was trapped in a small, boring life, and that Mark, quiet, steady, unremarkable Mark, was entirely unworthy of her. He convinced himself, in the private world of that journal, that it was his role to take her, to keep her, to protect her from a life he'd decided wasn't good enough for her. The obsession grew from there like something diseased. He began parking his truck down their street at night, memorizing when their lights went off, learning their schedule down to the minute. When the wedding came in September, he couldn't stay away. He parked across from the church in the dark, watching them load gifts into their car, boiling with a quiet, private rage. He had no idea that Sarah, stepping out for one last photo of the empty parking lot, had caught his face in the flash of her camera. Then Miller turned to the entry dated October 14, 1988, the day they disappeared. And the story written there wasn't one of two people getting lost in the woods. It was a calculated ambush. Thorne had known about their trip to Mount Hood for weeks, from listening through open windows. He waited for them on the highway and followed a few car lengths back the entire way. In the passenger seat, Sarah had pulled the envelope of wedding photos from her purse to pass the time, flipping through the glossy prints, and then, almost absent-mindedly, pulled out the dark, unprinted negatives and held them up to the afternoon sun coming through the window. That's when she saw his face. And when she looked up and out the back window, she saw the same dark truck, still trailing behind them. Panic exploded in that car. According to Thorne's own writing, Mark hit the gas, swerving across the yellow line, desperately trying to gain distance on a road with no cell service, no police, no other drivers for miles. In that terror, Mark grabbed the pen and pressed those two sentences into the map with everything he had, a warning for anyone who might one day find them. But Mark was an accountant, not a stunt driver, and Elias Thorne had spent his entire life behind the wheel of heavy machinery. 10 miles before the cabin, he slammed his truck into the back of the station wagon, sending it spinning off the highway and into a muddy ditch hidden behind a line of trees. What happened next, written in that same neat, obsessive hand, was a nightmare. Thorne climbed out with a hunting rifle. Mark and Sarah were bruised, terrified, but alive, and Mark fought. Unarmed, he threw himself between Thorne and his wife, fighting with everything he had to protect her. But Thorne was simply too big and he had a rifle. He struck Mark unconscious with the stock of the weapon, dragged a screaming, fighting Sarah out of the wreck, bound both their hands with logging rope, and threw them into the covered bed of his truck. He drove them straight back to his 60-acre property and down into the very bunker where his journal would eventually be found. Thorne had expected, in his twisted way, that Sarah would eventually come to see him as her rescuer. Instead, she fought him with a fury that never once broke. She spat in his face. She screamed until her voice was gone. She told him she would rather die than spend another second looking at him. And when Thorne finally understood that nothing would ever break the bond between her and Mark, he murdered them both that same night, in the freezing dark of that underground room. Captain Miller had to stop reading for a moment. The bunker felt heavier with every page, the silence around him almost unbearable. But the most chilling part of the confession wasn't the murder itself, it was what came after. Because Thorne knew that once police realized the couple was missing, the entire county would search for them. He needed a decoy. He needed to build a ghost story so convincing that no officer would ever think to look at his own 60 acres. Before sunrise that Saturday, he drove back out, chained up the station wagon, and hauled it across the mountain to the opposite side of the range entirely, to that remote, unpaved logging road near Whisper Basin. He staged it all with chilling precision, the purse on the floorboard, the map on the dashboard, never realizing that Mark's frantic handwriting had already scarred straight through the paper. He pushed the locks down, shut the door, left the keys behind. Then, in his own hunting boots, he walked in a straight, deliberate line into the trees, making sure to leave a clean trail, all the way to the river, where he waded in and let the current wash his scent downstream for 2 full miles before climbing out onto bare rock, where no footprint could form, and hiking home. He had built an impossible puzzle in the middle of the wilderness, a puzzle with no solution because every piece of it was fake. And then, in the coldest act of all, Elias Thorne walked into the Oak Creek Police Precinct and volunteered to help. He stood shoulder to shoulder with detectives. He handed Mark's grieving brother a cup of coffee. He pointed his own finger at search maps, quietly steering K-9 units and helicopters away from his own land, again and again for 2 full weeks, watching an entire town tear itself apart with grief while hiding behind the face of a helpful, humble woodsman. For 31 years he kept a watch, a ring and a set of car keys on a table in the dark, like trophies, like proof to himself that he had outsmarted everyone. Captain Miller closed the journal. Nobody in that bunker spoke for a long moment. The mystery of the locked car, the single trail of footprints, the map with its frantic red circle, all of it finally made a terrible kind of sense. "Bring the digging equipment," Miller said quietly. "They're here." They never made it to the mountain. The final pages held a crude hand-drawn map of the property, marking one specific spot deep in the blackberry thickets, far from the bunker itself. By 3 a.m, under the glare of portable stadium lights and freezing rain, the excavation began. Nobody complained. Nobody stopped. At 4:15 that morning, a shovel struck something wrapped in rotted canvas, and the digging paused while forensic anthropologists took over with brushes and hand tools, working with a kind of careful reverence that comes only from knowing exactly what you've found. Buried side by side in that cold earth for more than 30 years were Mark and Sarah Evans. And even in death, something about the way they were found broke every hardened officer standing at the edge of that grave. Mark's arm was still wrapped around Sarah's shoulders. He had been holding her. He had protected her until the very last moment he had left to give. When the sun finally rose over Oak Creek, painting the wet gray clouds in faint purple and gold, Captain Miller drove back to the precinct in total silence, his uniform caked in mud, utterly hollowed out. David and Harris were still there, having not slept at all. Miller set his belt down on the desk and looked at David with red, swollen eyes. "We found them, David," he said, his voice cracking. "We brought them home." For a fraction of a second, the words simply hung there. Then 31 years of not knowing, 31 years of staring out windows, of hoping, of wondering whether they'd simply run away, shattered all at once. David collapsed forward in his chair, sobbing in a way that echoed down the empty hallway, the sound of a man finally setting down a weight he had carried his entire adult life. He cried for his brother. He cried for Sarah. And he cried for his mother, who had died just a few short years too soon to ever learn the truth. Harris rose slowly and placed a trembling hand on David's back, his own tears falling silently. 31 years of guilt, the crushing knowledge that he had let a killer walk his own search teams in circles, finally began just slightly to lift, replaced by something quieter. Grief, yes, but also at long last peace. The arrest sent shockwaves far beyond Oak Creek. News stations broke into their morning broadcasts to show footage of the raid, and a story that had haunted the region for 3 decades suddenly became national news. Thorne, placed in isolation, refused to speak. He wouldn't look at the evidence. He wouldn't look at the journal when they set it in front of him in the interrogation room. He simply stared at the wall, eyes empty, a man who had lived so long inside his own dark version of reality that there was nothing human left to reach. The legal process moved fast because the evidence left no room for doubt. The plaster cast matched perfectly. The photograph placed him at the wedding. The journal was, in effect, a full written confession to a double murder. 3 months later, in a packed and silent courtroom, a judge sentenced Elias Thorne to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no reaction as it was read. He was let out in chains, head down, and would die alone in a concrete cell 4 years later, forgotten, exactly as he had once forced Mark and Sarah to be. But this story doesn't end in a courtroom. It ends on a warm spring afternoon, when the town of Oak Creek gathered together for the first time in 31 years to say goodbye properly. The church where Mark and Sarah had been married was filled, grown adults who had once been Sarah's second-grade students, co-workers from the shipping firm, neighbors who still remembered a green station wagon pulling away from a curb one Friday afternoon in 1988. Captain Miller and a retired Thomas Harris stood quietly near the back doors in their dress uniforms, watching a community finally find a way to heal. David stood at the podium, older now, gray at the temples, his voice steady. He didn't talk about the man who had taken them, or the rain, or the woods, or the bunker. He talked about a quiet accountant who loved his wife so fiercely that he threw his own unarmed body between her and a rifle. He talked about a bright young teacher who refused to break, who fought a much larger, much stronger man until the very last breath she had. He talked about their laughter, their kindness, the small, ordinary, beautiful life they had managed to build together in just 4 short weeks of marriage. Afterward, at the quiet cemetery on the hill overlooking town, 2 caskets were lowered into the ground beside Evelyn's grave, mother and daughter finally reunited, finally at rest. David stayed behind long after everyone else had gone. Sunlight filtered warm through the old oak trees. He reached into his pocket and pulled out that small yellow envelope, sliding the strip of negatives free, holding it up one last time to the light. For 31 years, the truth had been sitting right there, trapped in a few frames of chemical emulsion, hidden in a dusty attic, waiting patiently to be found. It proved that evil can hide behind a helpful smile. That a monster can stand right beside you, pouring you coffee, pointing calmly at a map, while knowing exactly where your family lies buried. But it also proved something far more powerful than that. It proved that the truth doesn't stay buried forever. The earth gives its secrets up eventually, a footprint pressed into mud, the scar of a pen dragged hard across paper, a shadow caught by accident in the corner of a photograph nobody thought to develop. They wait in the dark, patient and unerased, until someone is finally brave enough to look closely. David set the envelope gently down on the cold stone of the grave marker, turned up his collar against the breeze, and walked slowly down the hill toward his car. Behind him, the wind moved quietly through the grass, carrying with it the faint, sweet scent of autumn pine, and for the first time in 31 years, Oak Creek was finally, completely at peace.